How is it that churches and other Christian organizations not only become toxic, but they remain toxic for years, if not for decades? How is it that every time we hear about one of these fallen leaders, we find that it's not a one-time event that happened, but it's a pattern that stretched back years and included multiple victims in organizations that are committed to sharing God's love? How does that happen? Well, here's the key to understanding that. Churches experience a toxic event when a sick, unhealthy person uses their power in the church to traumatize another individual. But churches develop a toxic culture when other people, well-meaning, much healthier, who would never dream of traumatizing someone in the same way, they misdiagnose what has happened and they use the wrong principles to try to resolve the issue. Let's unpack exactly how that happens, and I have two hopes in doing so. The first hope is that this will give leaders a different paradigm to think about so that when a toxic event happens in the church, it doesn't embed itself and become a toxic culture. I would love it if we could keep our churches and Christian organizations more healthy, more thriving, and really exemplifying God's love in a true way. My second hope is if you have been traumatized by a church leader, I hope this will help you have a fuller understanding of exactly what happened to you and why it hurt so deeply, and to give you a way forward in your healing. Hi everybody, this is Greg from Heart Tools, where we make it simple to build great relationships. And although we have intentionally designed Heart Tools to be accessible and helpful to anyone, regardless of their background, history, worldview, religious beliefs, because we really do believe that most people want to love well, and they want to be a great spouse and a great parent, family member, great friend. They want great relationships, and they want to know how to do that. So we designed Heart Tools to be accessible to anyone to do that, regardless of their religious belief. At the same time, we do create Heart Tools from a Christian perspective, and it's been our hope especially that churches and Christian organizations would utilize Heart Tools as a way of helping their people learn how to excel at loving well and building strong, deep, healthy relationships. And it's been a lot of fun to see that happen. But here's what I've noticed. Churches can honestly want to become more loving and still develop a toxic culture. So let's explore that. Let's explore how churches and other Christian organizations that really do want to love well develop a toxic culture. And here is the key to that. Churches develop a toxic culture when they confuse trauma and conflict. Churches become toxic when someone in the church is traumatized by a leader, and the leaders of the church try to apply conflict resolution principles to resolve the situation. Conflict and trauma are entirely different animals. And the healthy way to resolve conflict is completely different from the healthy way to help someone overcome trauma. So let's start with some definitions. When I say a church has a toxic culture, I'm not talking about a church with a different theology than yours, or a different leadership structure than you're comfortable with, or a different stance on social issues, or they don't let you be on the worship team, or they won't let you start this ministry that's important to you. You can have a lot of differences and conflict with church leaders and the church not be toxic. A church has a toxic culture when, for whatever reason, it tolerates its people being traumatized. That's what a toxic culture is. A church that tolerates its employees being traumatized, its volunteers being traumatized, or its members, participants being traumatized. When that happens, you've developed a toxic culture. When we say trauma, the trauma can be one of three kinds. It can be acute, that is a single traumatizing event. The trauma can be chronic, that is a repeated and prolonged series of events, or the trauma can be complex. And so there's varied and multiple kinds of ongoing trauma. So whether it's acute or chronic or complex, the trauma will be something like sexual harassment. It will be something like abuse, sexual assault, physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse. And it could be something like bullying. And I'm going to do a separate video soon on bullying because I think it's the least understood, but it may be the most prominent type of trauma that happens in a church setting. But for now, what I'm talking about with bullying is not someone who scares you or intimidates you. But I'm talking about two things. One is you're a victim of bullying if there's been a series of lies, manipulation, gaslighting, ostracizing, passive-aggressive behavior, manipulation, intimidation for the purpose of controlling your thoughts or controlling your behavior. That's one kind. The second kind is you are the target of a bullying campaign when someone has decided, either consciously or unconsciously, because bullies aren't always conscious of what they're doing. They're not that healthy. But either consciously or consciously, you've been targeted with two goals. The one is to destroy your reputation, and they're very good at it. And the other is to poison your relationships, and they're very good at it. And the research is pretty clear that this is one of the most traumatizing, dehumanizing experiences that we can go through. So what happens then is churches develop toxic cultures when one of these traumas happens to someone in the church, and the leaders, instead of seeing it as trauma and treating it as trauma, they see it as conflict, and they try to apply conflict resolution principles to it. Now, the good news is there are a lot of churches that have a pretty healthy biblical approach to conflict resolution, usually kind of embedded in Matthew 18, which is a great place to start with conflict resolution. But what I want to do is kind of play out for you what that conversation looks like when someone is trying to apply conflict resolution principles to someone who's been traumatized, right? So imagine you know and love someone named Jane, and she's been traumatized. Maybe she's been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted by someone on staff. And maybe we'll call him Pastor Johnny. And I just want to walk you through what that conversation looks like. And it will sound monstrous to you that people who've been traumatized are told these things, but I guarantee you, these are the conversations that happen either with or about people who have been traumatized in the church. So imagine this person named Jane seeks help from another leader in the church, and that leader will say something to Jane like this. They'll say, hey Jane, I'm so glad we're meeting. I really want to see if we can resolve this problem in a way that honors God and protects the unity of our church. And I think the first step is you need to get in a room with Pastor Johnny and just talk out your differences, because it's very clear you both have completely different perspectives on what has happened here. And the Bible says if you have someone against them, the first step is to go and talk to them personally. And then they may say something like, you know, I've done a lot of conflict resolution in my career, and one thing I've learned is it's never one-sided. It's always two people share responsibility. And so it'd be nice if you had the humility in that meeting to think maybe 10% of this is your fault. It may be closer to 40%. But if you're going to have that meeting, I would advise you to go in with that idea. And then they may say something like, and I'll have to be honest with you, Jane, if you're not willing to talk to Pastor Johnny about this face to face, I'm going to ask you not to talk about this to anybody else in the church, because that would be gossip. And gossip is a cancer in the church, and it's just something that we're not prepared to allow. And then they may say something like, you know, Jane, there was another woman last year who was saying similar things, but she also wasn't willing to meet with Pastor Johnny face to face. And unless one of you do that, our hands are tied, because we don't want to be responding to gossip. That wouldn't be fair to Pastor Johnny. That's not healthy. And then he may say something like, you know, I'll be honest with you, Jane, neither you or this woman has been acting in a very loving manner. You both kind of seem really angry and maybe even hateful towards Pastor Johnny, and there just doesn't seem any Christian love in your heart. And yet when we talk to Pastor Johnny, he just tells us how much he loves you and how much it hurts him that, you know, you have this division in your relationship, and he just wants to meet with you and see if he can work things out. And then they may say something like, and you know what, Jane, you've really changed recently. You're not yourself. And some of us are wondering if maybe the enemy isn't using you to sow division in the church and to attack Pastor Johnny and to attack what the church is doing. And then he may say something like, you know, Jane, when you think about all the good stuff being done in this church and all the good stuff Pastor Johnny is doing, it's just confusing to me why you would be so selfish as to want to make everything about you. And then finally, he may say something like, you know, we've heard that after last Monday's event, that you are considering taking legal action against Pastor Johnny, and we need to let you know we will view that as a direct attack against the church, because the Bible says we're supposed to deal with all of our problems internally and not expose the church to public ridicule. So here's what happens when someone's already been traumatized and then it's dealt with as though it were a conflict resolution problem. The person who's already been traumatized is cast in the role as the villain, right? They're cast in the role of the person who's unspiritual, unloving, selfish, vindictive, and even demonic, right? Just for saying, I've been harmed and I need help. The second thing that happens is this process re-traumatizes the person, right? So they already have the original trauma, and now they have this re-traumatizing, because the people they go to for help and count on for help actually exacerbate the trauma that they've already experienced, and sometimes it's even worse than the original trauma that they've experienced. And the third thing that happens is this person then, when they are most wounded, most damaged, and most in need of help and support and nurture from their church community, end up ostracized and even demonized and left all alone, generally with their family. And so the whole family unit is left alone to suffer with this trauma. And at the same time as all this is happening with the person who's been traumatized, the person who did the traumatizing is seen as the victim. He's seen as the one that this unspiritual person won't even go talk to and just do basic conflict resolution with. And the traumatizer gets all the support, and the church rallies around, or the leadership, because sometimes the whole church doesn't know, but the leadership rallies around the traumatizer. And the result is the culture of the church has just become toxic because it's learned to tolerate its people being traumatized while being very proud of their commitment to healthy conflict resolution, right? And that's where it sets in and becomes part of the culture. So let's talk about how you deal with trauma and how it's different from how you deal with conflict resolution. Here's the first difference. You don't ask a traumatized person to meet with the person who traumatized them as the first step in resolving the issue. In fact, the only reason why you would ask a traumatized person to meet with the person who traumatized them is much later, sometimes years later, when the traumatizer is ready to accept responsibility and ask forgiveness. But in a church setting, that's the only reason why you would want to get those two together in the same room. When you're dealing with conflict, it makes sense that the first step is to go to the person you have conflict with. One of the reasons is because generally the person you have conflict with, and you've done this enough to know, they don't know they have conflict, right? They don't know they crossed your boundary, or they interrupted you, or they insulted you, or they took something that belonged to you. They have no idea. So it makes sense to go to them as a first step and say, hey, we have this conflict. Can we resolve it? The second reason why it's good to go to the person you have conflict with is because generally conflict is never one-sided, right? And so there may be a different perspective that you don't see. You may have a part in the conflict that you need to own. And so that's why it's helpful to go and talk to the person you're in conflict with. And the third reason is the person you're in conflict with is most likely a good person who would like to resolve the conflict. And so there's a high degree of success in conflict resolution if the first thing you do is go to the person that you have conflict with. None of these things are true when the situation involves trauma. It's just not true to think that the traumatized person has never spoken directly to the person who's traumatized them. There have been multiple messages. Things like, please stop doing that. I don't like that. You are crossing my boundaries. That is wrong. Several messages given to the traumatizer that are minimized, that are gaslighted, that are responded to with manipulation and sometimes threats. So the idea that there hasn't been communication directly to the person is just never true. The second difference between conflict and trauma is while conflict is almost never one-sided, trauma is always one-sided. You're not 10% responsible if you get sexually abused. It's just not true. Trauma is always one-sided. And the third difference is while in conflict, most people are really good-hearted and will engage in conflict resolution, and so it's a great first step to resolution to meet with them directly. That's just not true with people who traumatize other people. People who are willing to traumatize other people tend to be narcissists, at least in a church setting. There are other disorders and other pathologies, obviously, that would allow someone to traumatize another human being. But in the church leadership, they tend to be narcissists. And what's most important to a narcissist is that their public image matches their private kind of hyperinflated self-image that they have, that they're a great spiritual leader, they're just like Jesus, or they're the most humble, loving servant. Whatever their picture is of themselves, they need the public image to match that. And this image needs to be protected at all costs. And narcissists don't tend to have the ego strength to say, yeah, I really hurt someone. I did something that really caused another person pain. They don't have the capacity to empathize or feel remorse. Now, they do have what is called cognitive empathy. They understand how empathy works. They know how to use it, right? They know how to cry in front of someone to get someone to feel sorry for them and to get someone to think that they really are hurting about this broken relationship with someone. That's cognitive empathy. What they lack is real empathy, and that is the capacity to empathize with the pain that they've caused another human being and to feel remorse for that. If the situation involves trauma, the first step is simply to do an independent investigation to see if the trauma really happened. That's the question. The only question is it true, right? Did this really, was this person bullied or not? Was this person sexually assaulted or not? And so you want to do an independent investigation to discover that. And by independent investigation, I mean that the person accused of the trauma isn't part of deciding how the investigation is done or who does the investigation. And neither are their friends, whether they're on the board of directors or elder board or whatever the leadership structure, their friends don't do it. You get someone independent to decide, is this trauma really happened or not? That's the only question you're concerned about first. And if you discover that it is true that the trauma did occur, then your next step is to protect, restore, and help to make whole the person who has been traumatized. You want to realize that they have been harmed deeply and that they're vulnerable and they need the support of their community now more than ever. The other thing you want to do if it's trauma instead of conflict is, as you restore the traumatized person, you want to remove the traumatizer from positions of authority in the church, no matter how painful it is. And you want to do that so that the church cannot become toxic and so that you protect future victims from being harmed. Think about what happened with the Catholic Church, with the very public exposure, with the lawsuits of people saying, 20 years ago when I was a kid, I was molested by a priest, and the church just found it too painful to remove the priest from authority. And so they ostracized the victims and they protected the abusers. Sometimes they stayed in the same parish doing the same stuff. Sometimes they were moved somewhere else and no one was warned about what had happened, and so they could continue to harm other kids. Think what would have happened if the Catholic Church right away said, no matter how painful it is, we are going to remove these people from positions of authority. And while we're talking about that instance with the Catholic Church, let's deal with this idea that you never sue a church. That's always the worst thing you can do, because I think it fails to recognize the fact that on a fallen planet, we don't always get to choose between this is the good choice and this is the bad choice. Sometimes we're in a situation where this is the bad choice and this is the worst choice. So in that situation with the Catholic Church, which is the worst choice? To not sue and protect the reputation of the Catholic Church, is that the worst choice? Or is the worst choice to sue and protect other kids from being abused down the road? Well, clearly, the worst choice there is to not sue. It's just simply not true that the worst thing you can always do is sue a church. And wouldn't you rather have a leadership with a mindset instead of, boy, we're a church, you can never sue us, that's always wrong? Wouldn't you feel better if the leadership had the mindset, man, if we are traumatizing people, we want that to be brought to light and exposed no matter how painful, which would lead to a healthier church? Let's start taking trauma more seriously in the church and in Christian organizations. Let's stop dealing with trauma as though it's another garden variety conflict that we need to manage so that we can keep our churches healthy and thriving and actually expressing and reflecting God's love for people. If you're watching this video and you have been traumatized by a leader in the church, and if you were after that ostracized by the church, I want to let you know there's a reason why it hurts so badly, right? There's a reason why you're angry all the time, or perhaps even filled with rage, right? Rage is a very appropriate reaction to being traumatized. Or there's a reason why you're depressed all the time, if that's how this is kind of played out in your life. There's a reason why you can only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night, or why you sleep all day long. There's a reason why your immune system seems compromised and you just seem to get sick all the time, right? There's a reason why your capacity to trust in leadership has been damaged. And it's because you don't have unresolved conflict. You've been traumatized. And because you've been traumatized, you are probably going to need some help to get some healing. Now, fortunately, there are a lot of great Christian therapists who specialize in trauma recovery. So if you find yourself stuck in the pain of what you went through, you don't need to stay there. You can get help and get your life back again. The second thing I want to tell you is it is not gossip to talk about the trauma that you've experienced. You don't have to keep that to yourself. In fact, what you need is you need to share your story, at least with people who are there to help you heal. Now, whether you tell your story to protect future victims or not, you don't have to do that. But I want you to know it's not gossip if you choose to do that. If you are a leader in the church, I would encourage you to start asking a new question when problems arise. And that question is this a conflict that needs to be resolved, or does this sound like trauma, right? So if you have someone or several people talking about how they've been sexually harassed or sexually traumatized by someone in the church, you don't have a gossip problem. You have a trauma problem. If you have 3 employees and they all love their church and they love their job and they've always excelled at it, and in the same 6-month span of time, they all say, I have to quit this job because the emotional and psychological cost of coming to work is more than I can bear. And they all point to the same person or the same couple of people as to why that is. You don't have unresolved conflict. You have a trauma. And we need to start asking ourselves, is this conflict or is this trauma, so that we could deal with each in the appropriate manner. And the second thing that you may need to do is you may need to go back and undo some harm that you have done. If someone was going through trauma and you dealt with it as conflict and you ended up minimizing the damage that occurred to them and you ended up ostracizing them from their community, you may need to reach out and begin the process of undoing that and, if possible, restoring them to their community. And then finally, if you are the person who's done the traumatizing, whether it's been exposed and you've been removed from ministry or whether you're still getting away with it, I would encourage you to stop hiding behind the idea that you're the more spiritual person because you were the one who was willing to meet and resolve conflict and the other person didn't want to. You don't have unresolved conflict with people. You've traumatized people, right? And your only path forward is to own it, to enter a structured and lengthy recovery process with a professional to try to figure out, why is it that I could traumatize people and feel no remorse and no empathy for them? And then at some point, to reach out either through a letter or a meeting and ask them to forgive you for traumatizing them. That's it. That's the only path back towards spiritual integrity that's open to you. If you know someone who has been traumatized in a church and then ostracized, please share this video with them if you think it's going to be helpful for them in understanding exactly what happened to them and why it has caused such damage. Also, please share this with other leaders if you think it will be helpful for them to have this wider paradigm to think through when problems arise in their churches or organizations, to be able to ask themselves, is this a conflict to be resolved, or is this trauma to be dealt with, and how do you do each one? Because if you can help your church or organization maintain a really healthy culture, and then in that culture, give them all the skills and tools they need to know how to develop deep, life-giving, healthy relationships, you are going to be creating an environment in which really good things can grow. And at Heart Tools, we want to help you do that. We will teach you the 4 stages that you need to go through to build healthy, life-giving relationships, and we will help you master the skills that you need to master to do each stage very well. There is enough trauma in this world without the church or Christian organizations adding to it. Let's keep our cultures free of toxicity and create cultures where healthy, loving relationships can thrive.